If you've ever flipped through a newspaper, or more likely scrolled through social media, then you definitely know what a comic strip is. Typically with 3 or 4 panels and most often featuring a light or comedic tone, comic strips have been a part of the cultural media zeitgeist for about a century. They've evolved a lot from the black and white newspaper comics such as Charles Schultz's Peanuts to the more colourful plethora of webcomics you see online today on sites like Instagram, Twitter, or Webtoon. However, they all have a few things in common. They tend to release at a faster schedule and look really fun to draw. I remember spending late nights on the toilet reading comic strips as a kid, and now as an adult I'll occasionally have a day where I binge them online. They often have simple appealing art styles and a quicker turnaround, which can give the impression of a less stressful workflow. Regardless, I've always felt enticed to create one of my own. And really, who hasn't? I'm sure most of us have drawn little comics in school books or on loose paper. I know I sure have. So today, that's exactly what I'm going to do, and I'll bring you along for my process of creating it. To preface, I already have a bit of a history of making comics. I made a daily comic strip in my last year of high school called Varmints. It was about 3 animals typically unloved by society: Melvin the rat, Griffith the raccoon, and Shirley the bat. I kept up with it for a month straight, and then it trailed off, and I never really got back into it. It's unfortunate, but it was a fun experience, and I still hold these 3 characters close to my heart. I've also done a few other non-comic strip comics, such as a horror story about reindeer herders in Kamchatka, and the occasional event comic, but today isn't about those comics from the past. Instead, I'll be making this comic strip about 6 of my newer characters. I mainly draw and post them to social media. They've existed in a void for the longest time, so I've been gradually building more of a world around them, and this little comic strip will be part of that process. Allow me to introduce them. First up is Stingo. This little guy is kind of like my mascot. He's a little dingo with a big appetite, and not a lot of thoughts, but he has a heart of gold and gets along well with others, unless they're competing for his food. Next up is Rusty the crocodile. He's actually the oldest of the group here, so he often has to act a little more grown up. As a result, Rusty is a very calm and level-headed croc, and often spends his afternoons sleeping. Plus, he's kind of a 2-in-1, because he's always with his best friend Chitori. Chitori is a little bird, and she lives on Rusty's nose. While Rusty is chill, Chitori can have a bit more of an attitude. Then, different from the animals, we have Bin Bin. She's a small and very shy little trash can. She's a bit insecure and is the smallest member of her family. She can also be a bit of a downer, but luckily she has her friends to cheer her up. Then we have Books. This stinky fish decided to get up and walk his own life. Books is a bit of a troublemaker and likes to play tricks. However, he is ashamed of his appearance, so he wears a paper bag on his head. In addition to Stingo, we have Fetch, his brother. He's also a dingo, but a black-haired breed. They don't see each other much because Fetch is in a travelling jazz band, but the brothers are still close regardless. Fetch has a cool attitude and is very skilled with multiple instruments. And finally, we have Mary. This little lamb grows crops on the farm she inherited from her grandmother. She enjoys singing to her crops to help them grow. She's very sweet and likes sharing her fruits and vegetables with the other characters. In fact, she loves plants so much that she has sprouts growing where her horn should be. So those are the 6, technically 7 if you count Chitori, characters we'll be working with. For inspiration, I decided to take reference from a few comics, mainly Peanuts and comics made for Sanrio characters. Peanuts captures a similar tone to what I was going for. It has jokes, but rather than being the whole point, Peanuts is very reflective and emotionally driven. And then Sanrio was more of an art style inspiration. A lot of my characters are influenced by this Japanese mascot character design philosophy in some way, so I was curious to see how they handled it dialogue and action-wise. It can be hard to make such chubby, small characters have expressive poses. After doing some research, I also set some ground rules. For example, which characters can speak and which can't. Mary can speak fine because she runs a farm and is intelligent, whereas Stingo is pretty much a regular dog, with the brain of one too. Meanwhile, some characters like Bin Bin and Fetch don't speak verbally, but you can read their thoughts. Now onto the first comic. I'll be playing the time-lapse for each comic and talking a bit about my process behind each one. I decided to make the first one about Mary because, despite being the newest, she's quickly becoming a favourite of mine, and she's quite easy to come up with stories for. But I also decided to include Stingo as the punchline. Honestly, for the first comic, I'm quite happy with how it turned out. I don't usually go for lineless stuff unless it's a full illustration, but I think the colours all work well here and show off a bit of Mary's life. Not sure how well known the punchline is of a lot of fertilizer being bone-based, but I at least like it. I also like how I made some of the art pop out of the frame, like with Mary's ear in the second panel. Overall, a solid start. Next up, I did a comic with Stingo as the main focus. Honestly, he's probably the hardest to come up with good concepts for. I think it's because he's one of the older ones, and he's pretty much a regular dog, so I'm a bit stuck in my ways of him, and he's existed in the void for the longest. I am pretty happy with the idea I had in the end, though, of him pulling up a whole dinosaur skeleton. The biggest things I struggled with here was the background and the colours. I've always struggled to render grasses and make them look good in a colour palette. They're a lot browner than I would have liked, but I still think they look okay. The biggest issue was the sky though. I definitely made it too bright and didn't change it until the very end. A little detail that I liked was in the second panel. I drew a simplified Stingo based off his old design in his thought bubble. I was on a good stride, so I got to work on the third comic starring Rusty and Chitori. And honestly speaking, this one has to be the worst of the batch, and my least favourite. I don't think the colours work, it just looks dull and messy rather than shady like it's supposed to. Rusty was a lot more difficult to draw than I expected. Doing this comic made me realise how flat his design is. The lineless art style came back to bite me here. The backgrounds definitely look muddy and unclear, and I struggled a bit with the concept because I didn't want it to look like Rusty was taking advantage of Chitori or anything. By the end, I just wanted to get done with this one. I'm sorry, you two. You deserve better. At least Chitori was cute in it. Following those three, I proceeded to not make any comics for a week. I know it's bad. I got caught up with life a bit, doing things outside art and work, so I ended up procrastinating on them. Part of that was because I didn't like how the last comic looked, so I was worried about how the remaining three would turn out. Eventually, I got so fed up with it that I decided to make event comic, and I did so with Bin Bin. Bin Bin was the perfect choice for event comic like this to air my anxieties and frustrations. Because, well, she's a very anxious character. She's more personal to me. I can project a bit of myself onto her, and I was able to make a comic about the anxieties of not being productive enough, and how crippling art block or burnout can be. Both of these are regular issues for me, and I'd like to make a video about it at some point in the future. It's very simple, being only a few colours, but I think it was healthy to get it out of my system, and it got me back into the swing of things. Doing this comic reminded me that, a bit like journaling, comics can be a great way to express yourself and your feelings. Comic making should be enjoyable and therapeutic, not stressing about perfectionism. The next comic was another one I was worried about doing. Rather than being a joke or vent art, this comic starring Brooks was going to be an origin story for him. I've actually had the idea for this comic since when I first created Brooks back in 2020, but never got around to actually making it, due to a mix of busyness and those aforementioned anxieties. So naturally, with about 3 years of build-up, working on this comic was a bit intimidating. So how did it turn out? I actually liked it. I decided rather than going too far and experimenting with a lineless art style, I stuck with what I know and what I'm good at. This made it a bit less stressful and more of a comfort piece for me to work on. I like how the colours turned out. In the end, going for a more limited palette of blues definitely worked for it, and then that last panel with Books riding off into the sunset really stands out because of it. It was also fun to draw the little details of the old man's fish stall, and I referenced the Tsukiji fish market in Tokyo for the look of it. One thing doing this comic has taught me is to be more aware of the level of detail I should put into each panel. For example, the third panel on Rusty's comic was way too bare and got muddled by the lack of line art and similar colours, whereas the first panel in Books' comic has a much nicer look to it. There's more detail, but I didn't go too overboard with it. I think the simpler colours helped to balance it out. All in all, it feels really good to finally get this comic out there and establish Brooks a bit more as an actual character. Finally, we had Fetch's comic. This one ended up being a reflective piece of my whole journey across these 6 comics, and 2 to 3 weeks of art as a whole. I knew that from the beginning I wanted to do a monochromatic comic, and Fetch seemed to fit it best since he already is quite monochromatic in design, and the more abstract colours and background suits him as an artist. He's a wise, cool guy. I think he'd give good advice. I went lineless again, but I think it worked best here just because of how simple it is. I ended up making the comic about both flow state and burnout, which I'm sure most artists can relate to. Both happened to me during this experience. I started out really motivated working on the comic for Mary and Stingo, but then after being disappointed by my result for the third comic, it shattered that flow state and left me burnt out and unmotivated. I ended up doing some other stuff like playing video games and spending time with friends. In the end, it was the right and healthier thing to do, but I still stressed the whole time for not being productive enough, or not being good enough. But just like the last panel in the comic here, I eventually did get back to working on the art, just like I always do. Yes, I may not have been in a flow state like I was earlier, but I still got back to my art and ended up happy with a lot of the results. To me, this cycle is part of what makes artists who we are. We're constantly growing at odds of ourselves, our insecurities, and a lot of external forces beyond our control, but we often always find ourselves coming back to the art. So I finished all 6 comics, yay me! I'm genuinely surprised at how reflective it made me, but that can be one of the many joys of making comics. There's no real right or wrong way to go about it. You can go lineless, have detailed line art, simple designs, or buff Macho Man. Tone-wise, it can be all over the place, from funny to serious and dramatic to everyday slice-of-life stuff. Comics are an excellent way to express yourself, and can be a good way to get consistent art practice. Will I continue to make comics, or make this an ongoing comic strip? Well, I don't think so. I realistically couldn't make comics like these on a daily schedule, or any consistent schedule. The workload, especially for fully colored comics, is huge. There's a reason why a lot of Japanese manga artists die young. And if I tried to stick to a strict schedule with them, I'd eventually end up burning out. But aside from that, doing these comics made me realize that, at least for me, making videos is my kind of own way of doing comics. They're how I express myself. Videos are a bit like my own journal with drawings, where I reflect upon my experiences or the things that inspire me. I definitely think I will continue to make comics in the future every now and then, just not as my main thing. I certainly don't regret this experience, and I enjoy doing it a lot. If you wanted to try making a comic but haven't gone around to starting it yet, do it. It can be a lot of fun, and you'll learn a lot, both art-wise and about yourself. Who knows? It might just be your next big hobby. Hello, thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like, comment, and hit the subscribe button to see more videos like this. And if you want to see more of the comics in the full size that I drew them in, you can check them out on my Instagram. The link to that will be in the description or on my channel about page. Thank you for watching, and I'll get to work on the next one. Right, bye-bye.